The old mansion glowed with golden lights as carriages rolled up to its wide steps. Inside, laughter and chatter filled the air. Men in black coats and women in elegant gowns moved gracefully through the grand hall, their voices echoing softly against the tall marble walls. At the center of it all stood a polished piano shining under a crystal chandelier. Tonight was meant to be an evening of music, charm, and pride. Among the guests, there were servants moving quietly, carrying trays, serving drinks, and keeping to the corners. One of them was a young woman with tired hands but gentle eyes. Her hair was neatly tied, her uniform plain and old. She walked silently, making sure every guest had what they needed. Most of them never noticed her. To them, she was invisible, just another worker blending into the background. As she passed near the piano, her eyes lingered for a brief moment. It was as if that instrument was calling to her, whispering something from a faraway memory. But she quickly turned away and continued her work, careful not to be seen staring. In a corner of the room, a group of young guests laughed among themselves. They had been drinking and whispering jokes about the servants. One of them, the host's son, was especially loud and full of pride. He noticed the servant girl glancing at the piano earlier, and a cruel idea formed in his mind. He whispered to his friends, and soon their laughter grew even louder. "She keeps looking at the piano," he said with a smirk. "Maybe she thinks she can play." "Oh, that would be amusing," another replied. "Imagine her trying to perform for the guests." Their laughter turned heads, but no one paid much attention to what they were planning. The young man stepped forward, walking straight toward the servant girl. She froze when she saw him approaching. He spoke politely, but his tone carried mockery. "Excuse me," he said, pretending to be kind. "We were wondering if you could do us a favor. Would you play the piano for everyone tonight? You seemed quite interested in it." For a moment, she didn't answer. Her eyes widened slightly and her heart began to beat faster. She knew what this was. She could see the amusement in their faces. It wasn't a real invitation, it was a joke meant to humiliate her. The guests nearby had turned to look. The room went quiet for a brief moment, everyone waiting to see what she would do. One of the older guests frowned, sensing the cruelty behind the offer. But no one said anything. She lowered her gaze and replied softly, "I don't think that would be proper, sir." But the young man insisted. "Oh, come now. It's just for fun. You do know how to play, don't you?" A few people chuckled. Others whispered, clearly entertained by the idea. She wanted to disappear. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the empty tray to her chest. She could feel her throat tighten, but she forced herself to breathe. "Please, I have work to do," she said softly. The young man smiled, pretending to be kind. "Don't worry about that. We'll allow it." "Everyone, let's give her a chance," the crowd murmured. Some were curious, others uncomfortable. The host, standing near the door, gave a small nod, not realizing what was happening. "If she wants to, let her," he said simply. He didn't think much of it. Now all eyes were on her. The servant stood frozen beside the piano, the laughter echoing faintly around her. For a moment she thought of walking away, but then she saw the piano again, its black and white keys shining under the light, waiting quietly. Something inside her shifted. She took a slow breath. Maybe this was cruel. Maybe they wanted to laugh at her, but part of her heart longed to touch those keys again. It had been so long since she had felt music beneath her fingers. Without saying a word, she placed the tray on a nearby table and walked toward the piano. The laughter died down slightly. People leaned closer. The young man and his friends exchanged smirks, waiting for her to embarrass herself. She sat down carefully, her back straight, her hands resting above the keys. The room fell silent. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. The chandelier light reflected in her eyes, soft and still. For a few seconds, she didn't move. She simply looked at the piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys. Her thoughts drifted back to another time, a small house where her father used to play an old piano. She could still hear his voice, gentle and patient, teaching her how to find music not just in sound but in feeling. "Music comes from here," he would say, placing a hand on her chest. "Not from here." He would tap her forehead lightly and smile. "If you play from the heart, even silence will listen." Those days were long gone. Her father had fallen ill, and soon after she had lost him. The piano had been sold to pay for medicine. Life became a struggle of survival, and dreams faded into long days of work and worry. But now, sitting in front of this grand piano, that buried part of her began to breathe again. The crowd watched in quiet confusion. Some guests whispered to each other, wondering if she actually knew how to play. The young man who invited her folded his arms, smiling with mock confidence. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her fingers touched the keys light as a feather. The cold ivory felt strange yet familiar. She took a deep breath and pressed one note. It rang through the hall clear and steady. Something about that single sound drew attention. The laughter stopped completely. The note lingered, pure and perfect, echoing softly through the space. Then she pressed another, and soon a quiet melody began to form. The young man's smile faded slightly. There was something in her touch, delicate yet powerful. The other guests leaned closer, their curiosity growing, but before she could truly begin, she lifted her hands again. The sound stopped. She looked down at the keys, her heart beating fast. Doubt crept in again. Was this foolish? Would they laugh if she played more? She looked up briefly and saw the faces around her, waiting. Her gaze fell on an older woman in the back who gave her a small nod and a gentle smile. It was enough. The servant girl smiled faintly and lowered her hands again. She was ready to play not for them, but for herself, and for the father who once told her that music could speak louder than pride. But just as her fingers were about to move again, the host clapped his hands suddenly. "All right, everyone, let's not delay the evening further. The recital will begin shortly," he said with a cheerful tone, unaware of what was about to happen. The moment broke. The guests turned away, their conversations returning. The young man chuckled, feeling victorious. Perhaps next time," he said mockingly as he walked past her. The servant girl sat there for a second longer, staring at the piano. Then she stood, quietly stepped back, and returned to her work. No one noticed the faint tears she wiped away as she passed by the guests. Later that night, as the professional pianist prepared to perform, she stood in the hallway, carrying a tray of glasses. Through the open door, she could see the same piano waiting under the light. She didn't hate them. She just felt a deep ache inside, not for herself, but for the music that remained unheard. But destiny has a way of turning small moments into great stories. What began as a cruel prank would soon become the night that none of them would ever forget. Because once her fingers finally touched those keys again, no one in that grand room would leave unchanged. The night after the recital, the mansion was quiet. The guests had gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume and candle wax. The young servant walked slowly through the empty hall, collecting glasses and folding napkins. The piano stood there in silence, the same one she had touched hours ago. She paused beside it, her reflection faint in its polished surface. Her fingers brushed lightly over the keys. She didn't press them this time. She just stood there, remembering the sound that almost came alive. Her heart felt heavy but calm. The humiliation didn't sting as much as the memory. She had been so close to playing, so close to letting her father's music speak again, but maybe it wasn't the right time. She took a breath, looked at the grand chandelier above her, and whispered quietly, "One day." Then she picked up her tray and walked toward the servants' quarters. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. The servants were already busy, preparing breakfast for the household. The head maid called out instructions, and everyone hurried. The young servant joined them silently, her face calm but her mind far away. She kept hearing that one note she played. It echoed inside her like a promise she couldn't forget. Later, when her duties were done, she stepped outside to hang the linens. The morning breeze carried the sound of birds, and for a moment she closed her eyes. She imagined she was back in her childhood home, where her father's piano stood near the window. He used to play every morning before work, filling the small house with warmth. Even when money was tight, music never left their home. She remembered the day he first taught her how to play. Her hands were too small, her fingers clumsy, but he smiled and said, "Don't think of the notes. Think of the story you want to tell." She had laughed then, but now she understood what he meant. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about feeling. Those memories comforted her. But they also hurt. Her father's illness had changed everything. He had grown weaker with each passing month, and soon she was forced to leave school to earn money. She found work in homes like this one, cleaning, cooking, doing whatever she could. Life became routine, quiet, and lonely. But she never forgot the piano. Whenever she passed one in the homes she worked in, She would stop for a moment just to feel its presence. In this mansion, she had never dared to touch it, until last night. That single note reminded her that a part of her was still alive. That afternoon, while she was dusting the hall, the host's wife entered the room. She was a gentlewoman, kind but distant. She noticed the servant standing near the piano again and paused. "You seem to like that instrument," she said softly. The servant hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. It's very beautiful." The lady smiled faintly. "Do you play?" The young woman lowered her eyes. "A little, ma'am. My father taught me when I was small." The lady nodded thoughtfully. "That's lovely." She looked at the piano for a moment and then back at the servant. "I heard some people were teasing you last night." "I'm sorry about that. It was not right." The servant's heart raced. She didn't expect anyone to notice, let alone speak of it. "It's all right, ma'am," she said quietly. "I didn't mind." The lady studied her for a moment, then said gently, "Sometimes people forget that talent and grace can be found in the most unexpected places." And with that, she walked away. The servant stood there for a long time, those words echoing in her mind. Talent and grace. Unexpected places. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, she returned to the hall. The candles were out, but the moonlight shone through the windows, lighting the piano just enough for her to see. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cover. She sat down slowly and took a deep breath. Then, without thinking, she began to play. The first sound was soft, hesitant, like a whisper, afraid of being heard. But as she continued, the notes grew stronger, fuller. The music rose and fell like waves. It was a song her father had written when she was little, a song about hope. She had almost forgotten it, but her fingers remembered. They found the keys like old friends meeting again after years apart. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't stop. She played until the moonlight shifted and the last note faded into the air. It was as if the house itself had paused to listen. Then she smiled faintly, wiped her tears, and whispered, "Thank you, Papa." She stood up, covered the keys again, and quietly slipped back to her room. The next few days passed quietly, but something in her had changed. She worked with a new calmness, a quiet confidence that others began to notice. Even the head maid, who was usually strict, found herself speaking more gently to her. But not everyone was pleased. The host's son, who had started the prank, still remembered that moment of embarrassment when she almost turned his joke into something real. He had expected her to stumble and fail, but that single note she played had caught him off guard. It had sounded beautiful. It bothered him in ways he didn't understand. He began watching her, curious but also uneasy. One afternoon he entered the hall and found her polishing the furniture near the piano. "You really think you can play, don't you?" he said casually. She looked up, unsure how to answer. "I don't think about it much, sir." He stepped closer. "You surprised me that night. For a moment I thought you actually knew what you were doing." She didn't reply. She kept cleaning, her movements calm and steady. He smirked. "If you're so good, why don't you prove it? Let's see if you can impress anyone." She stopped and looked at him, her eyes gentle but firm. "I don't need to impress anyone, sir. I play because I love it." Her answer caught him off guard. There was no anger, no fear, just quiet strength. He turned away, uncomfortable. "You talk like someone who thinks she's better than her place," he muttered. She shook her head. "No, sir. I just don't believe kindness or talent belong to any one class. They belong to whoever keeps them alive." He didn't reply. He left quickly, but her words stayed with him longer than he expected. That evening, while the family was dining, the host mentioned that a famous piano maestro would be visiting next week for a private recital. The young servant heard this from the kitchen and felt her heart skip. The same maestro her father admired years ago. She used to listen to his music on the radio when she was a child. Just knowing he would be here made her feel both excited and afraid. The next few days were filled with preparation. The mansion was cleaned from top to bottom. Flowers were arranged, and the piano was tuned until it sounded perfect. The servant worked tirelessly, making sure everything was ready. But inside her heart, a quiet dream was forming. She didn't dare to speak it aloud, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could hear him play in person. Maybe she could learn something new, something that would make her father proud. On the evening of the maestro's arrival, the mansion sparkled with candlelight once again. The guests arrived in their finest clothes, whispering excitedly about the famous musician. The host and his wife greeted everyone with smiles. The young servant stood near the back, ready to serve. her heart racing as she caught sight of the maestro, a calm, silver-haired man with kind eyes. As he took his seat near the piano, everyone clapped politely. The servant watched from a distance, holding a tray but barely breathing. The maestro began to play, and the sound filled the hall like sunlight breaking through clouds. His fingers moved effortlessly, the melody rich and full of life. The servant felt tears forming as she listened. Every note touched her deeply, like her father's spirit speaking through someone else. When the performance ended, the guests stood and applauded. The maestro smiled humbly, bowing slightly. The servant lowered her head, quietly clapping along from the corner. But just as she turned to leave, she felt someone tap her shoulder. It was the host's wife. "You were listening very closely," she said softly. "Do you play this piece too?" The servant froze. Her voice caught in her throat. I know a little of it, ma'am." The lady smiled. "Perhaps you can show us one day." The words startled her. "Show us?" Before she could respond, the lady had already turned back to the guests. The servant stood there, her heart pounding. For the first time, the thought didn't scare her. Maybe this was how fate began to open its doors, quietly, one small moment at a time. The night of the maestro's visit stayed fresh in her mind for days. Every note he played echoed in her thoughts while she worked. She swept floors and served tea with quiet grace, but her heart was still filled with music. The lady of the house's words replayed in her ears. "Perhaps you can show us one day." It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried a weight of possibility. She didn't dare believe it fully, but hope had already found its way into her heart. In the early mornings, before anyone else was awake, she began sneaking into the hall. She would lift the piano cover slowly so it wouldn't make a sound, sit down and let her fingers move across the keys. Her touch was soft, careful not to wake anyone. Sometimes she practiced the same piece the maestro played, trying to remember every note from memory. Other times she played her father's old tunes, the ones that spoke of longing and light. She never played for long, just enough to feel alive again. The moment she heard footsteps or the sound of doors opening upstairs, she would stop, wipe the keys clean, and return to her chores as if nothing had happened. One morning, as she played softly, she didn't notice someone standing by the door. It was the host's wife. The lady had come down early to read, but instead she found the servant sitting at the piano, lost in her music. The sound was tender, full of emotion. The lady didn't speak or move. She just listened. When the last note faded, she quietly clapped her hands together. The servant turned in shock, her face pale. She stood up quickly, bowing her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't." But the lady stopped her. "No, don't apologize. That was beautiful." The servant's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're not upset?" "Upset?" The lady smiled softly. "Why would I be upset at something so lovely? You play with feeling." "That's rare." The servant looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, ma'am. I learned from my father. He used to teach music before he passed." The lady nodded slowly. "It shows. You play from the heart." For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her about her music with kindness. That moment stayed with her long after the lady left the room. Days passed, and whispers began to spread quietly among the household staff. Some of them had heard her play during her early mornings and were amazed. "Did you know she can play like a professional?" one whispered to another. "I thought it was the radio," said another, laughing softly. They admired her talent, but they also warned her to be careful. If the master's son hears, he'll make trouble again. But fate was already setting its stage. A week later, the family planned another evening gathering, a small dinner with close friends. The host's son, still carrying his arrogance like armor, overheard his mother mentioning that the servant girl played the piano beautifully. He frowned. "She? Play beautifully?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You must be mistaken, mother. She probably just makes noise." His mother smiled gently. "You'll see. Sometimes talent hides where we least expect it." He shrugged, not believing a word. When the evening came, the mansion once again filled with guests and music. The piano gleamed under the chandelier, waiting. The maestro was not there this time, but his spirit seemed to linger in the air. As the dinner ended, the lady of the house turned to her husband and said softly, "I'd like our servant to play something tonight. Just a small piece." The host raised his brows in surprise. "Our servant? Are you sure? She deserves a chance, the lady said with a calm smile. The young man across the table chuckled quietly. This should be interesting. The servant was called into the hall. She arrived nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw all the eyes on her heart began to race. She didn't know her secret practice had been discovered. Her mind went blank for a moment. The lady gave her a reassuring nod. Play something you like. The servant took a slow breath. Her hands trembled as she sat down at the piano. The guests whispered among themselves, unsure what to expect. The young man leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to make a fool of herself again. But when she pressed the first key, the room fell silent. The sound that filled the air wasn't shaky or uncertain. It was warm, full of feeling. Her fingers moved gracefully like she had been born to do this. The melody flowed gently, telling a story without words. A story of loss, love, and quiet strength. The laughter that had started died quickly. Every guest's eyes turned toward her. Even the host looked amazed. The lady smiled softly, proud and moved. The young man's smirk slowly faded. He didn't want to admit it, but the sound touched something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt before. He stared at her hands, watching how they danced over the keys. The servant didn't notice anyone. She was lost in the music. Her eyes closed, her soul poured into every note. She wasn't playing for the crowd. She was playing for her father, for the little girl she once was, for the dreams she buried under years of silence. When she finished, the room stayed still. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone began to clap. Soon the entire room joined in, their applause filling the hall. The servant looked up, startled. She hadn't expected that reaction. Her face turned red and she lowered her head shyly. The lady walked toward her and placed a hand on her shoulder. That was wonderful, she said warmly. You have a gift, my dear. The servant tried to speak, but her voice trembled. Thank you, ma'am. The guests began to murmur excitedly. Who taught her? She plays better than most trained musicians. Incredible. The host's son sat quietly, unable to join in the praise. His pride burned, but deep down he knew he had been wrong. After everyone left that night, the servant helped clean the hall as usual. The lady of the house stayed behind, watching her. You should not hide this talent, she said kindly. Music like yours can change lives. The servant smiled faintly. Music already changed mine, ma'am. It keeps me alive, the lady nodded. Still, you deserve more than this. Would you like to learn properly again? I could speak to a friend, but a music teacher. You could study on your free hours. The servant's eyes widened. The idea seemed too big to believe. You would do that for me? Of course, said the lady softly. You've earned it. Tears welled in her eyes. She lowered her head and whispered, Thank you, ma'am. I'll never forget your kindness. The next morning, the household buzzed with talk about the servant's performance. Even the other workers looked at her differently now, with respect and quiet admiration. But one person stayed distant, the host's son. He couldn't stop thinking about the way she played, the calmness in her eyes, the grace that came without pride. It bothered him and humbled him at the same time. Later that day, he found her in the garden hanging laundry. You played well last night, he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. Thank you, sir. He hesitated before speaking again. I was wrong before. I shouldn't have mocked you. She gave him a small, forgiving smile. It's all right. I've learned that people often laugh at what they don't understand. He nodded slowly, unable to meet her gaze. Still, I'm sorry. Thank you, sir, she said kindly, then returned to her work. For the first time, he walked away in silence, thinking deeply. Her words had touched something in him that pride couldn't protect. That evening, when everyone had gone to bed, she returned to the piano again. This time she played softly, not for practice, but for peace. Her music filled the quiet hall like a gentle promise. She didn't know what her future would hold. But for the first time in years, she felt that maybe, just maybe, her life was beginning to change. Outside, the wind rustled through the garden trees, and the moonlight spilled through the tall windows. The sound of her piano blended with the night, quiet, steady, full of heart. She didn't see it yet, but this was only the beginning. Soon her music would reach far beyond those walls and touch lives she had never dreamed of. Days turned into weeks, and the servant's life began to feel different. The mansion still carried the same routines, the same footsteps and voices, but inside her, something had changed. Every time she passed the piano, she felt warmth instead of fear. The lady of the house had kept her promise and arranged for her to take lessons from a kind old music teacher who visited once a week. It was only for a short hour in the evenings after her work was done, but for her it meant everything. The teacher, a gentle man with silver hair and patient eyes, immediately recognized her gift. He watched her play one of her father's songs and smiled. "You play from memory," he said softly. "That is rare. Music doesn't just live in your hands, it lives in your heart." She blushed slightly. "My father taught me that long ago." "Then he was a wise man," the teacher said. "Let's make sure his lessons never fade." Under his guidance, she learned to read sheet music again, something she hadn't done since she was a child. She practiced scales and chords, but also played pieces that allowed her to pour emotion into every note. Each day after her chores, she would sneak into the hall, sit quietly, and lose herself in sound. The piano became her only friend, her only escape, and her greatest joy. The lady of the house often listened from the doorway without saying a word. She admired not just the servant's talent, but also her humility. Despite her growing skill, she never showed pride. She played like someone grateful for the gift itself, not the attention it brought. But as word spread quietly through the household about her progress, not everyone reacted kindly. Some of the other servants whispered that she was getting special treatment. A few grew jealous, thinking she had forgotten her place. "She's lucky the mistress likes her," one of them muttered. "Otherwise, she'd be punished for touching that piano." The young servant heard their whispers but didn't respond. She had no anger in her heart for them. She simply smiled and continued her work, knowing that dreams often made others uncomfortable. The host's son, however, watched her differently now. He no longer laughed or mocked. Something about her calmness and the way she carried herself unsettled him. One evening, he entered the hall and found her practicing. He stood in silence as she played a slow, emotional tune. When she finished, she turned and saw him standing there. She froze for a moment, unsure whether to speak. But he spoke first. "You've improved," he said quietly. She nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." He stepped closer. "You really love it, don't you?" Her voice softened. "More than anything in the world." He studied her for a long moment. "You don't belong here," he said finally. She frowned, unsure what he meant. "I'm just a servant, sir." "This is my place," he shook his head. "No, people like you don't stay hidden forever. One day someone will hear you play and they'll know your worth." His words surprised her. For the first time, he spoke without pride, almost with respect. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. When he left, she sat there for a long time, her thoughts tangled between disbelief and gratitude. The following week, the mansion prepared for another grand gathering. A charity concert was being hosted to raise funds for local schools, and several musicians were invited to perform. The lady of the house, moved by the servant's progress, had an idea that shocked everyone. She called her husband and said softly, "I want her to perform." He stared at her. "You mean our servant? In front of our guests?" "She deserves the chance," the lady said firmly. "Let them see what I've seen." The host hesitated but finally agreed. "Very well. If she's ready, let her play." When the servant heard the news, she could hardly believe it.
"Me perform in front of everyone?"
she asked with trembling hands. The lady smiled gently. "You're ready. I believe in you." The night of the charity concert arrived with bright lights and elegant guests. The grand hall was decorated with flowers, and the piano shone like a jewel in the center. The servant stood behind the curtains, her heart racing. She could hear the murmur of voices, the soft laughter, and the clinking of glasses. It felt unreal. The music teacher, who had come to support her, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't think about them," he said. "Close your eyes and remember why you love music. That's all you need." She nodded, her breath shaking. As her name was called, a hush fell over the room. The guests turned to look at the young woman stepping forward in a simple dress, her hands trembling slightly. Some recognized her as one of the household servants and whispered in surprise. She sat down at the piano, feeling the weight of every stare. Her vision blurred for a moment, but then she remembered her father's voice, soft, patient, full of love. "If you play from the heart, even silence will listen." Her fingers touched the keys and the first note rose into the air. It was clear, gentle, like the beginning of a story. The melody grew slowly, each note falling perfectly into place. The hall grew still. The laughter faded, the whispers vanished. The music filled every corner, rich and alive. She played not just with skill but with soul. Her song spoke of struggle, of quiet courage, of beauty found in pain. People leaned forward, captivated. The lady of the house smiled proudly, tears in her eyes. Even her husband, usually serious and reserved, sat in awe. As the piece reached its peak, her hands moved faster, the sound swelling with emotion. The music was no longer just sound, it was life itself. Some of the guests began to cry softly, touched by something they couldn't explain. They had never seen someone so humble create something so powerful. When the final note faded, silence filled the room again. It lasted only a moment before applause burst out like thunder. People stood, clapping, cheering, some even shouting her name. The servant sat frozen, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had never heard applause meant for her before. The lady of the house stepped forward, helping her stand.
You've given everyone a gift tonight, she whispered.
Be proud. The host shook her hand, smiling warmly. You have a rare gift, young lady. That was no ordinary performance. The servant bowed deeply, overwhelmed by emotion. Her eyes searched the crowd and found the host's son. He was standing, clapping silently, his eyes soft with something like admiration. For once, he wasn't mocking or proud. He was simply humbled. Later, when the guests had gone, the lady approached her again. You've done something wonderful tonight, she said. People will remember this performance for a long time. The servant smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't do it for them. I did it for my father.
And for myself.
The lady nodded, her eyes glistening. He would be proud. That night, the servant returned to her small room. She sat by the window staring at the moon. Her hands still tingled from the performance, her heart still raced. She thought of her father again and the little house they once shared. She imagined him smiling, listening from somewhere beyond the stars. The world outside that mansion had no idea what had happened inside those walls. But for her, everything had changed. She was no longer just a servant who worked in silence. She was a musician who had found her voice again. Before going to bed, she whispered into the night, Thank you, Papa, you were right. Music does belong to the heart. And somewhere deep within her, she knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far greater than she had ever dreamed. The morning after the charity concert, the mansion felt different. The air seemed lighter, as though something pure had been left behind from the night before. Servants spoke softly, the host smiled more warmly. And even the guests who stayed overnight couldn't stop talking about the servant girl who had stolen the evening with her piano performance. She woke early as usual, still half unsure if what happened had been real. Her fingers ached slightly from playing so passionately, but her heart was full. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror beside her bed and smiled. For the first time, she didn't see just a servant. She saw a musician, someone who had shared her soul with the world and been heard. When she stepped into the main hall, the lady of the house was waiting with tea and a soft smile. You must be proud, the lady said kindly. The young woman lowered her eyes. I'm just grateful you gave me a chance, madam. The lady shook her head. No, my dear. You earned it. You reminded everyone last night that greatness doesn't need a fine dress or a fancy name. It only needs courage. The servant felt warmth rise in her chest. Those words stayed with her for days. By afternoon, word had spread beyond the mansion. The guests who had attended the event couldn't stop talking about her performance. Some of them called the host, asking who she was, where she had trained, and whether she would play again. The host, once hesitant about letting her perform, now spoke proudly of her talent. The following week, a local newspaper printed a small article about the concert. At the bottom, in smaller letters, it mentioned a young household servant whose piano playing moved the audience to tears. It didn't use her name, but everyone in the mansion knew who it meant. The first time she saw the article, she could hardly believe her eyes. The teacher smiled when he read it aloud to her. You see, music travels fast when it's real. But fame, even small fame, came with change. Some of the servants who once whispered behind her back now tried to act friendly, though their eyes still carried envy. The young woman didn't let it bother her. She kept doing her chores, polishing the silverware and dusting the same hall she had always cleaned. Only now, when she walked past the piano, everyone noticed the quiet respect in the air. The host's son grew more thoughtful too. One afternoon, he found her sitting at the piano again, practicing a new melody. He hesitated before speaking. You played beautifully that night, he said softly. She nodded, still focused on the keys. Thank you. He walked closer, his voice low. You made me realize how wrong we were. All of us. She stopped playing and looked up, her eyes calm. It's all right. People often laugh at what they don't understand. He gave a small smile. You're kind. I wish I had your patience. The two stood there in silence for a moment before she turned back to the piano. Music teaches patience, she said. It also teaches forgiveness. He nodded and left quietly, her words echoing in his mind. Days passed, and one morning, a letter arrived at the mansion. It was addressed to the lady of the house, but carried exciting news. A local music society was hosting a small recital for young musicians, and the lady's friend, one of the event organizers, had heard about the servant's performance. They wanted her to play. The lady immediately went to her. You've been invited to perform again, she said with excitement. This time, not just for our guests, but for the whole town. The servant's eyes widened. For the town? But I can't, I'm not a professional. The lady smiled. You're more than that. You have a gift. Don't hide it. The servant hesitated, but eventually agreed. The teacher was overjoyed. He helped her prepare a special piece, one that blended her father's teachings with all she had learned since. For weeks she practiced in every free moment, pouring her soul into the notes. The night of the recital arrived. The small-town theater was full, with people from all walks of life, rich families, workers, students, and even a few who remembered her from the mansion concert. Backstage she stood quietly, her heart racing. She thought again of her father's gentle voice, of her promise to honor his love for music. When her turn came, she stepped onto the stage. There was no grand dress, no jewels, just her simple gown and a calm smile. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first note rang through the theater, clear and haunting. The melody spoke of simple things, hope, struggle, love, and loss. It reminded people of home, of childhood, of dreams they had forgotten. As she played, the audience leaned in, some closing their eyes, letting the music carry them. Every sound she made came from her heart. She didn't think about fame or approval. She thought about her father, her mother, the mansion, and the many days she had played in secret. Each note carried a memory. Each pause held emotion. When the final note faded, there was silence again. That deep, almost sacred silence that follows something truly beautiful. Then came the applause. It grew louder, rising like a wave that filled the entire theater. People stood, clapping and cheering. Some even shouted her name, though most still didn't know who she really was. After the performance, the host's family approached her backstage. The lady hugged her with tears in her eyes. You were magnificent, she whispered. The host shook her hand proudly. Even the son who once mocked her smiled sincerely. You've taught us all something tonight, he said. That talent and grace can come from the humblest places. She smiled softly. Music doesn't choose where it's born, she replied. It just waits to be heard. Soon people began asking if she would teach music. A few parents approached her, saying their children wanted to learn to play after hearing her. The idea warmed her heart. Teaching had been her father's dream, and now it felt as if it could be hers too. The lady offered to help her find a small place in town to start giving lessons. You'll still have a home here, she said kindly, but you deserve to share your gift. The young woman agreed. Within weeks, she found herself sitting in a small rented room with a simple piano and 3 children eager to learn. She taught them the way her father had taught her, not just how to press keys, but how to listen, how to feel. She told them, music is not just sound. It's a voice for the things you can't say. Word spread again, and soon more students came. Her small room turned into a small school, and her name became known in the town, not as a servant, but as a teacher and musician who played from the heart. Back at the mansion, the old piano still stood in the hall. Sometimes, when she visited, she would play it again, and the memories would come rushing back, the laughter, the whispers, the night that changed everything. But now there was no pain in those memories, only peace. One evening, as she finished teaching, she sat alone at the piano, looking out the window at the sunset. The light fell across the keys, warm and golden. She smiled quietly to herself. She had once been the servant no one noticed. They had invited her to play as a joke, but that night had opened a door she never knew existed. It had shown her that the world could be cruel, yes, but it could also be kind. It had taught her that even the smallest voice could move hearts if it spoke with truth. She pressed one last key, letting the soft note linger in the air. "For you, Papa," she whispered. "For every dream that never dies." And as the sound faded, she knew the music that once lived only in her heart had now found its way into the hearts of others. And that, more than anything, was her greatest reward. Years passed, and the town grew used to the sound of music drifting through a small room near the square every evening. Children came and went, their laughter filling the air, their tiny fingers learning to find magic in the piano keys. The woman who once worked as a servant had become someone everyone in town respected, not because of her fame, but because of her kindness. She never forgot her past or the mansion where her journey had begun. She often said to her students, "Music has no pride. It doesn't care who you are. It only asks that you play with honesty." Her small music school had grown over time. The piano that once stood alone now shared space with a few old instruments donated by grateful parents. She never charged more than people could afford, and sometimes she taught for free if a child's family was struggling. To her, every student mattered. She remembered how one kind teacher and one moment of belief had changed her own life. Every morning, she would light a candle near her father's old photo that she kept beside the piano. It was faded, the frame chipped, but it was her most precious thing. "You were right," she often whispered. "Music really does belong to the heart." One afternoon, a letter arrived for her, a neatly sealed envelope with a golden emblem. She opened it carefully. Inside was an invitation from the city's largest concert hall. They were hosting an event to celebrate local talents who had risen from humble beginnings. Her name was listed among the performers. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her heart thudding. She hadn't performed on a grand stage in years. Teaching had become her world, and she was content, but something deep inside her stirred. The same feeling she had the night she played for the mansion's guests. Her students were thrilled. "You have to go, miss," one little boy said. "You'll show everyone what music really means." She smiled gently. "It's not about showing anyone anything," she said softly. "It's about sharing what we love." Still, she agreed to go. The lady of the mansion, now older but still elegant, came to see her when she heard the news. "You've come such a long way," she said warmly. "Do you remember that night?" The young woman smiled. "I could never forget. It changed everything," the lady nodded. "You changed us too. You reminded us what grace looks like." The night of the concert came sooner than expected. She wore a simple gown, the same one she'd kept all these years. She didn't want anything new. Her music, she believed, didn't need glitter or gold. It only needed truth. As she stood backstage, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The faint sound of applause from the audience reached her ears. She could feel her father's presence as if he stood beside her again. When her turn came, she walked onto the stage with quiet confidence. The hall was full, lights shining softly across faces waiting in silence. Some people there knew her story. Others did not. But none of that mattered to her. She sat at the grand piano, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. Her melody was gentle at first, like a whisper. Then it grew, flowing like a river, touching every heart in the room. The music carried the story of her life. The pain, the struggle, the small kindnesses that had helped her stand tall. Every note was alive. Every sound carried meaning. The audience felt it, the purity, the strength, the love. As she played, she remembered the laughter that once mocked her, the cold floors she had scrubbed, the old piano that had been both her burden and her salvation. But now none of that hurt. It all felt distant, softened by time. Every hardship had led her here, to this moment of peace. When she reached the end, her fingers rested on the keys, and silence filled the hall once again. The kind of silence that feels sacred, as if the whole world had paused to breathe. Then came the applause. Not wild or noisy, but deep and heartfelt. People stood slowly, clapping with emotion. She smiled and bowed, tears forming in her eyes. After the concert, a reporter asked her for a few words. "What message would you like to give to young people who look up to you?" She thought for a moment, then said simply, "Don't be ashamed of where you come from. Every path, no matter how hard, can lead to something beautiful. And never let anyone tell you your dreams are too small." Her words were printed in newspapers across the city. People who had never heard her name before now knew her as the humble musician who rose from the simplest beginnings. But to her, that recognition didn't change anything. The next morning, she went back to her little school and began her usual lessons as if nothing had happened. Years continued to pass. Her hair began to turn silver, and her hands, once strong and quick, grew slower. Yet when she played, the same magic filled the air. Her students grew up, many of them becoming teachers, musicians, and kind people who carried her lessons forward. One cold winter evening, she sat alone at her piano after all her students had left. The candle burned softly beside her father's photo. Outside, snow fell quietly, covering the town in a white blanket. She played one final melody, not written on paper, not practiced or planned. It was something she made up in the moment, gentle and full of memory. It was the sound of gratitude for the laughter, the tears, the second chances. When the last note faded, she closed her eyes and smiled. The piano, her lifelong companion, seemed to echo her heartbeat. She whispered, "Thank you." That night, as the snow continued to fall, the town slept peacefully, unaware that the woman whose music had touched so many hearts had played her final song. The next morning, her students found her sitting beside the piano, her face calm, a faint smile still on her lips. The news spread quickly. People from all over came to pay their respects. The lady of the mansion, now frail and walking with a cane, stood before the piano where it all began and laid a single white rose on top. "You changed our world," she whispered, "and your music will never die." In her honor, the town renamed her little school the Heart's Melody Academy. Her old piano was moved there, restored and placed in a bright room filled with laughter and music. A small plaque beneath it read, "She was once a servant who played as a joke." But her melody taught us all what true grace sounds like. Every year on the same day she had first performed at the mansion, her former students gathered to play her favorite song. They would light a candle beside her father's picture, now framed beautifully on the wall, and tell the new students her story. And as the music filled the room, it always felt as though she was still there, smiling, guiding, reminding them that beauty can come from the simplest of hearts. The piano keys, worn smooth from years of touch, still carried her spirit, and those who listened swore that sometimes, late at night when the room was quiet and the moonlight touched the keys, they could hear a faint melody, soft, gentle, full of life. The same melody that once silenced arrogance and awakened love. Her story became more than a memory. It became a lesson whispered through generations, that kindness, humility, and passion can turn even the smallest life into a masterpiece. And so, though she was gone, her music never truly ended. It lived on, in the hearts she had touched, in the dreams she had inspired, and in every note that rose from that old piano, carrying her spirit through time.